November 1943, Bletchley Park, England, a Victorian country house in the Buckinghamshire countryside. From the outside, completely ordinary. Inside, the most important secret of the Second World War. A British analyst was at his desk. German submarine frequencies, encrypted transmissions, the routine work of a man who had been doing this for 3 years. And then, a message came through. He decoded it. The coordinates were exact. The timing was precise. He knew exactly where the U-boat was going to be, and exactly when. He closed the file. He walked out of the building, and said nothing. That night, a British convoy sailed directly into the position he had decoded. The U-boat was waiting exactly where he had known it would be. 17 men drowned. He went home, made tea, got into bed. He didn't sleep, but he said nothing. Why? Because using those coordinates would have told the Germans their code had been broken. And a broken code, once discovered and replaced, would cost far more than 17 lives. Far more than one convoy. The math was clear. He knew the math was right, and 17 men drowned anyway. Subscribe right now, because this story is about the heaviest kind of right decision. The kind where being correct doesn't make the weight any lighter. To understand what Edward Hollister was doing at that desk, and why his decision was the one it was, you first need to understand what Bletchley Park actually was, because most people have heard of it at this point. Enigma, Alan Turing, the imitation game. The broad strokes have made it into popular culture, but the specific operational reality, the constraints that people worked under, the rules that governed how the intelligence could be used, that part is less well known. And it's the part that explains everything about this story. Bletchley Park was the home of the British Government Code and Cipher School from 1939 onward. The people they recruited were not standard military personnel. They were mathematicians, linguists, chess champions, crossword puzzle solvers, people with a specific kind of mind that could find patterns in noise, could hold large amounts of information simultaneously, could work problems that looked unsolvable until they weren't. The problem they were working was Enigma, Germany's Enigma encryption machine, a device that used a series of rotors and a plugboard to encode messages in a way that produced billions of possible combinations. The settings changed daily. In theory, breaking one day's messages told you nothing about the next day's. The Germans considered it mathematically unbreakable. They were wrong. The British broke it. The work built on earlier Polish mathematical analysis. Alan Turing and Gordon Welchman developed the electromechanical bomb machines that could work through the combinations fast enough to be operationally useful. By 1941, significant volumes of German military communication were being read. This intelligence was codenamed Ultra, and Ultra was the most tightly held secret of the entire war. Edward James Hollister, born in Oxford, 1915. His father was a mathematics professor at Oxford. His mother taught Latin at a girls' school. The house he grew up in was full of books, full of conversation, full of the assumption that the most interesting problems in the world were intellectual ones. Hollister went to Cambridge. Mathematics, probability theory, combinatorics, cryptographic mathematics, the study of patterns in seemingly random sequences. These weren't subjects he found difficult. They were subjects he found enjoyable. In early 1940, he was recruited to Bletchley Park, Submarine Communications Analysis Division. His job, analyze intercepted German U-boat transmissions, decode encrypted coordinate messages, identify information that could affect convoy routing in the North Atlantic. The North Atlantic convoy routes were, in 1940 and into the mid-war period, arguably the single most critical strategic concern Britain faced. If the convoy stopped, if Germany's U-boat campaign succeeded in cutting the supply lines between North America and Britain, Britain would run out of food, fuel, and material within months. Ultra was keeping the convoys alive, and Hollister was one of the people keeping Ultra working. He did this for 3 years, methodically, precisely, with the specific discipline of a mathematician who understood that his work was only as good as its accuracy. And in November 1943, He opened the file that changed everything else. Before we get to the file itself, I need to explain the rules Hollister was operating under, because without understanding those rules, the decision he made looks inexplicable. With them, it becomes the only decision he could have made. Ultra-intelligence could not be used directly. That's the core rule, and it sounds simple, but its implications were enormous. If Bletchley Park decoded a message that said a U-boat was going to be at a specific location at a specific time, you couldn't just call the Admiralty and say, "There's a U-boat at these coordinates, reroute the convoy." Because if you did that, and the convoy avoided the U-boat, and the U-boat reported back that the convoy wasn't where it was supposed to be, the German Navy might start asking questions. How did the British know? Could they be reading our messages? So ultra-intelligence had to be disguised. It had to arrive through a plausible alternative source. A reconnaissance aircraft spotted the submarine. A different intelligence network reported the position. Something that explained how the British knew without pointing to Enigma. Sometimes this worked cleanly. The cover story was plausible. The convoy was redirected. Lives were saved, but sometimes it wasn't possible. Sometimes the intelligence was too specific, too coincidental, too close to previous near misses to be covered convincingly. Sometimes using it, even through a disguised channel, would have been too obvious. Would have triggered questions the Germans couldn't leave unanswered. And in those cases, Ultra was protected, and men died. This was a known, accepted, deliberate operational policy. It wasn't Hollister's policy. It wasn't any individual's policy. It was the considered judgment of the highest levels of British intelligence. The long-term value of Ultra was worth the short-term cost of not using it in situations where using it would risk its exposure. Hollister knew this. Everyone at Bletchley Park knew this. Knowing something as a policy and feeling its weight as a personal decision are very different things. November 1943, mid-month, early afternoon. Hollister was at his desk. Intercepted U-boat transmissions, frequency analysis, the routine work of a 3-year veteran of this particular kind of mathematical labor. A message came through for decryption. He worked the key. The daily settings had been established that morning. The message decoded cleanly. Coordinates, a specific Atlantic grid reference, date and time, a U-boat in position. Hollister looked at the coordinates on his map. He knew the convoy schedules. Access to that information was part of his analytical work. He needed to know what was moving, where to assess the threat potential of the intelligence he was decoding. On that route, that night, an HX series convoy. He did the calculation. U-boat position, convoy speed, and heading. The geometry of the interception. The math wasn't complicated. The U-boat would reach the convoy's projected position within the convoy's travel window. The interception was close to certain. He sat at his desk. He thought about whether there was a way to use this. A cover story that would hold. A plausible alternative source. A way to get the convoy rerouted without pointing at Enigma. He went through it carefully. The previous Ultra uses in this sector over the past few weeks, the pattern of German responses, what additional rerouting would imply about British intelligence sources. There was no clean path. Using this information, in any form, carried a risk of exposure that the operational guidelines said was unacceptable. He closed the file. He stood up. He left the building. Let me try to explain the full weight of what Hollister understood in that moment. By November 1943, Ultra was doing things that no single person at Bletchley Park could fully see. The intelligence it produced filtered through channels that kept its source invisible. To the British military using it, to the Germans being damaged by it, to almost everyone. But the strategic analysts who briefed the highest levels of Allied command had a picture of what Ultra was worth. In the North Atlantic alone, the battle between the U-boat fleet and the Allied convoys that Churchill called the most dangerous theater of the war, Ultra-informed convoy routing had been critical to the turning point of the Battle of the Atlantic in May 1943. The dramatic reduction in Allied shipping losses in the summer and fall of 1943 was, in significant part, a function of knowing where the U-boats were. The historian Harry Hinsley, who wrote the official history of British intelligence in the war, estimated that Ultra shortened the war by 2 to 4 years. 2 to 4 years. That's not a small number. That's millions of lives. Not hypothetically. The war was killing people at a rate that makes the calculation concrete and brutal. If Enigma had been compromised in November 1943, if the Germans had changed their code system in response, the restoration of that intelligence advantage would have taken months, possibly longer. In those months, convoys would have sailed blind, U-boat positions unknown, the Battle of the Atlantic's turning point potentially reversed. Hollister understood this, not as abstract policy, as mathematical reality. One convoy, 17 men, against the potential compromise of an intelligence source that was saving that many men or more every week. The math said what it said, and Hollister closed the file. He went home, a small flat near Bletchley, orderly, spare, books everywhere. The home of a man who lived mostly in his head. He made tea. He turned on the radio. Music playing. He turned it off. He sat at his kitchen table with a blank piece of paper in front of him. He didn't write anything. Hours passed. In the morning, he went back to work. He checked in at his section, waited for the reports that came in from operational sectors. Before lunch, the casualty report arrived. HX convoy, Atlantic. 1 ship lost, 17 men. Hollister read the report. He took it to his file. He wrote something in the margin. 4 words, in pencil. Then he filed it and went back to his desk. Let me stop here. Because what Hollister did was not wrong. He followed the protocol. He protected Ultra. The mathematical argument for his decision was sound and remained sound, and 17 men drowned, and he knew they were going to. I want to ask you something genuinely difficult. How do you carry that? Not was he right? I think we can agree the strategic calculation was correct. But how do you live with being right when the cost of being right is 17 people dead on a night when you had the information that could have saved them? Most of us never face anything like this. The situations in our lives where doing the right thing costs someone else something. They're real, but they're not this. 17 people. That's specific. What would you have done at that desk? I'm asking seriously. Drop it in the comments. And if this kind of story is what you're here for, subscribe right now. Every day on this channel. Stories like this. Hit the bell. Tell me where in the world you're watching from. Now let's go to the other side of that equation. The U-boat that intercepted the convoy that night filed a standard mission report. Coordinates, time of attack, results, the operational language of a successful engagement. For the German Navy, this was a normal night. A U-boat had done its job. The convoy had been in the predicted zone. The interception had worked. No questions were asked. No anomalies were noted. No one on the German side looked at that night and thought, how did the convoy not know we were coming? Why wasn't there a rerouting? Is there a leak somewhere? There was no reason to ask those questions because from the German perspective, the British hadn't known. The convoy had sailed its planned route. The U-boat had found it through its own operational positioning. This is exactly what Ultra's protection was designed to produce. A situation where British foreknowledge left no visible trace, where the enemy had no reason to suspect that their communications were compromised. Hollister's silence was part of producing that outcome. The 17 men who drowned were part of producing that outcome. The U-boat crew that filed their report without suspicion were, unknowingly, confirming that the most valuable intelligence source of the war remained secure. Hollister kept working. After that November file, more files came. More coordinates, more decisions. Sometimes a cover story held. A reconnaissance aircraft could plausibly have spotted a submarine in that area. The convoy could be rerouted without raising questions. In those cases, Hollister passed the intelligence and convoys were saved. But other times, the decision came back. The same calculation. The same weight. He made it. Each time, Ultra was protected. The war continued. The intelligence kept flowing. And Hollister kept going to his desk every morning and doing his job. In 1945, the war ended. Bletchley Park was closed. The staff were dispersed back to their civilian lives, and they were all told, say nothing, the Official Secrets Act, for life. Hollister said nothing. He would have said nothing without the Official Secrets Act. Hollister returned to Cambridge. Mathematics department, lecturer, then reader, eventually a professor. Probability theory, combinatorics, cryptographic mathematics. His exact specialization from the war years, now applied to purely theoretical problems. His students described him as a demanding but patient teacher. Brilliant, clearly, but somehow, elsewhere. Occasionally, he would stop mid-lecture, look at something in the middle distance, come back, continue. He married in 1948. One son. His son grew up knowing his father had worked somewhere in the war effort. The specifics were never given. When he was old enough to ask directly, his father said, "Desk work. It doesn't matter." He accepted that answer. There was something in his father's tone that made pressing seem wrong. I want to stay here for a moment. Hollister carried this for 30 years under the Official Secrets Act, but I don't think the law was the main reason for his silence. Think about what telling would mean if he told the story to his son, to anyone. What would he be saying? I knew where the submarine was. I had the information to save those 17 men. I chose not to use it, and I was right. Can you say that sentence to another person? Can you say it to the family of one of those 17 men? I was right not to save your father. The math worked out. The silence wasn't just legal compliance. It was, I think, the only honest response to a situation that had no clean resolution. The decision was correct. The cost was real. Both of those things were permanently true. And there was nothing to say that would make them less true. Silence was sometimes the most honest thing. But that silence, carried for 30 years, then more, has a weight that doesn't get lighter with time. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Would you have told someone? Who? And if you haven't subscribed, do it now. This conversation happens in the comments every day. 1974. The British government officially acknowledged the existence of the Bletchley Park operation for the first time. 30 years after the fact, Frederick Winterbotham published The Ultra Secret, the first public account of what had happened at that Victorian country house in Buckinghamshire. It was a bestseller. It rewrote the public understanding of how the war had been won. Hollister was 59 years old. He bought the book. He read it. We know this because his copy was found after his death, with margin notes in his handwriting. He did not contact Winterbotham. He did not give any interviews. He did not participate in any of the oral history projects that began collecting Bletchley Park veterans' testimonies in the late 1970s and 1980s. About the specific decisions he had made, about the specific nights when he had closed a file and said nothing, he remained completely silent, even when the law no longer required it. Let me put a number on what Hollister was protecting. Harry Hinsley, the official historian of British intelligence in the Second World War, concluded that Ultra shortened the war by 2 to 4 years. 2 to 4 years. The war was killing people at a rate of tens of thousands per month across all theaters. A 2 to 4 year shortening is not a marginal difference. It is millions of lives, specifically in the North Atlantic. The convoy battles that were the most direct application of Ultra's submarine intelligence. The impact is well documented. The shift in the Battle of the Atlantic in May 1943, when Allied convoy losses dropped dramatically and U-boat losses spiked, is directly connected to the quality of Ultra intelligence informing convoy routing and anti-submarine operations. If that intelligence had been compromised, if the Germans had changed their codes in response to evidence that Enigma was broken, that battle could have gone differently. The convoys could have started bleeding again. Britain's supply lines could have come back under serious threat. The 17 men on that November night were part of this calculation, not as people, as data points in a strategic equation that they didn't know they were part of, and that nobody would tell them about for 30 years. That's the specific horror of this story. Not malice, not negligence. A correct calculation whose terms the people paying its cost never knew. Here's the hardest question this story raises. Was Hollister right? From a strategic standpoint, yes. Unambiguously. Ultra was preserved. More lives were saved in aggregate than were lost that night. The war was shorter, the math worked, but there's a philosophical tradition that says certain things can't be justified by outcomes alone. That using people, even by inaction, even by not saving them, as instruments of a larger calculation, is a specific kind of wrong, regardless of whether the calculation is correct. Philosophers call these cases tragic choices, situations where every available option involves a genuine moral cost, not a trolley problem with a clean utilitarian answer, a situation where the right choice still involves doing something that is, in itself, wrong. Hollister didn't kill those 17 men. He didn't send the U-boat after them. He simply didn't tell anyone the U-boat was coming. He withheld information that could have saved them. Is there a meaningful moral difference between those things? I don't think there's a clean answer. I think that's the point. Hollister made the right call, and he kept a piece of paper with the number 17 on it for the rest of his life. Both of those things are true simultaneously. Hollister's file was not the only time this calculation was made at Bletchley Park. The operational guidelines that governed Ultra use, created by design, situations where intelligence that could save lives was deliberately not used. This was built into the system. It was the system working correctly. The most discussed potential example, the most controversial, is Coventry. In November 1940, the German Luftwaffe conducted a devastating bombing raid on the city of Coventry. Over 500 civilians were killed. The city's medieval cathedral was destroyed. Some historians have argued that ultra-intelligence provided advance warning of the raid and that Churchill chose not to evacuate the city or increase its defenses to protect Ultra. Others dispute this. The evidence is genuinely ambiguous. The question of whether Churchill knew the specific target in advance is still debated. What is not debated, the principle that Ultra required accepting cost to protect its existence was a real principle, applied in real situations, with real human consequences. Hollister's case is documented. The file exists. The casualty report exists. The 4 words in the margin exist. It is one confirmed instance of the price that Ultra's protection required. Hollister retired from Cambridge in 1989. He was 74. He moved to Devon, a small house near the coast, a garden, the sea within walking distance. In his last years, he rarely went far. He gardened, he read, he played chess by correspondence, a few long-running games with former colleagues. A neighbor who knew him in those years described him later. He was a gentle, quiet man, polite, but sometimes he'd be sitting in the garden and just stop, not doing anything, just sitting. I never knew what he was thinking. His son visited regularly. They played chess. They talked about mathematics, about Cambridge, about the grandchildren, not about the war. Hollister died in 1997. He was 82, in Devon, in his own home. His son cleared the house afterward. In a drawer, he found a small wooden box. Inside, a few photographs, a Cambridge faculty ID card, a letter from a former student, and a single piece of paper. On it, one number, written in pencil, 17. In the early 2000s, the Bletchley Park archives were opened more fully to researchers. A historian working through the submarine communications analysis files found Hollister's work. The November 1943 transmission, the decoded coordinates, the solution notes, and the convoy casualty report from the same date, HX series. 1 ship, 17 men. Then, the note in the margin of Hollister's file, in his handwriting, in pencil. Not passed to Admiralty. 4 words, no explanation, no justification, no expression of the weight of the decision or the night that followed it. Just not passed. The historian published a short paper in 2004. Hollister's name appeared in it for the first time in any public record. By then, Hollister had been dead for 7 years. In that wooden box, the box his son found after his death, there was one piece of paper, 17. Why did he keep it? He didn't need it as a reminder he wasn't going to forget. Nobody forgets 17 people. I think he kept it because it was the only honest thing he could do about those men. He couldn't name them. He couldn't tell their families. He couldn't make their deaths mean something in any public way. He couldn't even acknowledge that he had known they were coming. But he could write the number down and keep it. 17. Not a statistic. Not a line in a casualty report. 17 people who died on a night when he knew what was coming and said nothing, and were right to say nothing, and died anyway. The number was the only place he could put the truth of that. What do you think that number meant to him? After 30 years? After 50? Drop it in the comments. This one deserves the conversation. Subscribe, hit the bell, share this with someone who needs to think about it. Edward James Hollister's name appears on no war memorial. Bletchley Park has a museum now. There are exhibits about Turing, about the bomb machines, about the mathematical breakthroughs that made Ultra possible. There are names on the walls. Hollister isn't one of them. But in November 1943, at a desk in a wooden hut in the Buckinghamshire countryside, a man decoded a message that told him exactly where 17 people were going to die. He understood why he couldn't prevent it. He understood the calculation completely. He closed the file and walked out and said nothing, and went home, and didn't sleep, and came back the next morning, and read the casualty report, and wrote 4 words in the margin of a file that nobody would read for 60 years, not passed to Admiralty, and then went back to work. The number 17, kept in a wooden box for 54 years, is the clearest possible evidence of what that decision actually cost him. Not his certainty that it was right, he never wavered on that, but his refusal to pretend that being right made it costless. He knew what the number meant, he kept it anyway. As close as he could get to honoring 17 people he was never allowed to name. That, I think, is what integrity looks like when it has nowhere to go. If this one got to you, hit the like button. Subscribe for more every day. I find the stories that ended up in 4 words in the margin of a classified file. Ring the bell. Share this with someone who should think about it.